The knock on my workshop door came late, long after I'd locked up for the night. It startled me, as knocks often do when you live alone in a place as isolated as this. My workshop sat on the edge of the woods, far from the noise of town. I liked it that way, quiet, solitary, just me and the steady hum of gears and cogs. The knock came again, louder this time, and I sighed, setting down the tiny screwdriver I'd been using to adjust the delicate workings of a pocket watch. Wiping my hands on a rag, I crossed the room and unbolted the heavy door. A man stood there, hunched against the cold, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light of my workshop, was a horse-drawn cart. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, his voice low and strained. "But we were told you're the only one who can fix it." I frowned, glancing past him at the cart. "Fix what?" He stepped aside, gesturing to the back of the cart. I stepped out into the crisp night air and felt my breath hitch as I saw it. It was a grandfather clock, easily 7 feet tall, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The glass covering its face was cracked, and the ornate carvings on its frame were worn and weathered. But there was something undeniably striking about it. Something wrong? Even before the man spoke, I could feel it, a faint hum, almost imperceptible, emanating from the clock. "It's been in our family for generations," the man said. "Stopped working decades ago. My father tried to fix it, then my grandfather, but they couldn't. And now," he paused, swallowing hard. "Now it started ticking again." My stomach tightened. If it started working, why bring it to me? His eyes flicked to the clock, his expression haunted. "Because it shouldn't be ticking. The hands haven't moved, but it's ticking all the same. And things have been happening. Strange things." I hesitated, torn between curiosity and the instinct to send him away. But curiosity won, as it always does. "All right," I said, running a hand through my hair. "Bring it in?" He nodded, relief flashing across his face, and together we unloaded the clock. It was heavier than it looked, the wood cold and unyielding under my hands. When we finally maneuvered it into the center of my workshop, I noticed how the faint hum seemed to grow louder, settling into a rhythm that made my chest tighten. "You'll be able to fix it, right?" the man asked, his voice laced with desperation. "I'll do my best," I said, though my confidence wavered as I stared at the clock. The man left soon after, his parting words ringing in my ears. "Be careful with it. It doesn't just keep time." The moment the door closed behind him, I turned to the clock, its faint hum filling the silence of the workshop. I reached out, running my fingers over the carvings on its frame. They were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift slightly under the light, almost as if they were alive. Then I heard it, the first tick. It was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a shiver down my spine. The hands of the clock didn't move, yet the ticking continued, steady and unrelenting. I stepped back, unease settling over me like a heavy blanket. There was something wrong with this clock, something I couldn't quite name, and I had just agreed to fix it. The ticking followed me all night. I tried to ignore it, but it was relentless, echoing through my workshop no matter where I went. The hands on the clock face remained still, locked at midnight, yet the sound was as steady as a heartbeat. By midnight, I couldn't stand it anymore. I pulled a chair up to the clock, lit the lamp on my workbench, and set to work. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. The wood felt icy under my hands, and the faint hum I'd sensed earlier seemed to vibrate through my fingertips. I opened the glass panel covering the clock's face, and the air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating. Inside, the gears were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were intricate, impossibly delicate, with an iridescent sheen that caught the light in strange ways. I reached for my tools, carefully removing the first gear, and the ticking faltered for the briefest moment before resuming. "What are you hiding?" I muttered, leaning closer. As I worked, a strange sensation crept over me, a faint, disorienting pull, as if the room around me was shifting. The ticking seemed to grow louder, faster, and the light from the lamp dimmed. My vision blurred, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest. When I blinked, the sensation was gone. The lamp burned steady, the ticking was slower, and my tools lay neatly in front of me. But something was off. The clock face had changed. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the position of the hands. They had moved. Midnight was now 2 minutes past. I frowned, leaning back in my chair. Had I bumped the mechanism? No, it wasn't possible. I hadn't touched the hands. The ticking continued, soft but insistent, and the faint hum seemed to grow stronger. My head swam, and I realized I couldn't account for the last few moments. How long had I been sitting there? Minutes? Hours? I glanced at the clock on the wall. An ordinary clock I'd built years ago. The time didn't match. The hands of the workshop clock were a full 10 minutes ahead of where they should have been. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. My heart raced as the realization hit me. Time wasn't just passing in the usual way. The clock was taking it. The door to the workshop creaked open, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman, her face pale and drawn, her dark eyes wide with fear. "You have to destroy it," she said, her voice trembling. "What?" I managed, stepping toward her. "Who are you?" She ignored my question, her gaze fixed on the clock. "It's not just a clock. It's a curse. Every second it ticks, it takes something from you. From all of us." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I turned back to the clock, its steady ticking filling the air, and for the first time, I felt the weight of its presence, an oppressive, unrelenting hunger. And I realized she was right. Her words hung in the air like a blade over my head. "It's a curse. Every second it ticks, it takes something from you. From all of us." I stared at the woman, her gaunt face illuminated by the flickering lamplight. Her eyes, dark and sunken, flicked nervously between me and the clock as though it might spring to life and attack. "I don't understand," I said, my voice hoarse. "What do you mean it takes something?" She stepped closer, her thin frame trembling, and pointed a shaking finger at the clock. "Time. It's not just measuring it, it's stealing it. From everyone nearby. Every tick is another second gone, not just from you, but from anyone within reach." I blinked, my mind racing. It sounded insane, impossible, but the strange sensations I'd felt earlier, the disorientation, the heaviness, suddenly made sense. "How do you know this?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Her gaze dropped, her lips trembling. "Because it took my husband. He spent hours with it, trying to fix it. Days, maybe. But when he walked away, he was changed. Older. As if years had passed in the span of a single week. He told me to leave it alone, to let it rot. But it's never really gone, is it?" The hum of the clock grew louder, its ticking sharper now, almost accusatory. The woman flinched at the sound and took a step back. "I should have burned it," she said, her voice cracking. "But I couldn't. It doesn't like you. It finds someone else." My stomach churned, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. "Then why bring it to me?" I demanded, my voice rising. Her eyes filled with tears. "Because it won't leave us alone until someone fixes it. It's been dormant for years, but now that it's ticking again, it'll keep taking and taking until there's nothing left." The ticking seemed louder now, faster, and the faint pull I'd felt earlier was stronger, like the clock was drawing me closer with every beat. "Destroy it," she said, her voice urgent, "before it's too late." I turned back to the clock, its ornate carvings glinting faintly in the lamplight. The golden sheen of the gears inside seemed to pulse, as if the mechanism were alive, and the hands had moved again. 5 minutes past midnight now. "Why me?" I whispered, half to myself. The woman's voice was barely audible. "Because it always finds a clockmaker." Before I could respond, she turned and fled, the door slamming shut behind her. I was alone with the clock. Its ticking filled the room, relentless and unyielding, and the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. I stepped closer, unable to look away from the still face, the unmoving hands, the hum that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. For a moment, the ticking faltered, and I felt it, a faint, sharp pull deep in my chest like something was being ripped away. The clock wasn't just stealing time. It was stealing life. The workshop felt colder, darker, as if the clock were swallowing the light itself. The steady tick-tick-tick pulsed through the air, rattling through my chest like a second heartbeat. I tried to steady my breath as I leaned in closer to the face of the clock. Its intricate carving seemed to shift subtly under the lamplight, patterns twisting and writhing in ways I couldn't quite comprehend. The hands remained still, locked at 5 minutes past midnight, but the ticking persisted. The longer I stared, the more I felt it, the pull, the faint tug deep in my chest, as if the clock was drawing something out of me. I had to understand it. Sliding my chair closer to the workbench, I grabbed my tools and carefully opened the clock's back panel. The gears inside were pristine, untouched by time despite the clock's apparent age. They gleamed faintly, their golden surfaces etched with symbols I didn't recognize. It was unlike any mechanism I'd ever seen. Normally, a clock's gears worked in harmony, each movement predictable and logical. But this was chaos. The gears spun in opposing directions, stopping and starting seemingly at random. Yet the ticking remained constant. "Where are you getting your power?" I muttered, running my fingers along the cold metal. As if in response, the ticking grew louder, sharper, and the golden glow from the gears brightened. A sudden jolt shot through my hand, like an electric shock, and I yanked it back with a curse. The moment my fingers left the gears, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. My limbs felt heavy, my vision dim, and my thoughts scattered. I slumped in my chair, gasping for breath, as the ticking seemed to slow, mocking me. When I looked at the clock's face again, the hands had moved. 10 minutes past midnight. A sharp knock at the door startled me, breaking the oppressive silence. I staggered to my feet, still dizzy, and opened the door to find the man who had delivered the clock standing there, his face pale and gaunt. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You touched it, didn't you?" he said, ignoring my question. "What does it matter?" I snapped. "What is this thing? What did you bring me?" He strands, his eyes darting toward the clock. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Once it knows you, it doesn't let go." "Knows me?" I repeated, stepping back. "It takes what it needs," he continued, his words coming faster now. "Time. Life. It feeds on it, and the more you try to understand it, the more it takes. Then why bring it to me?" I shouted, my frustration boiling over. The man's expression hardened. "Because it chose you. The clock always chooses someone. And if you don't fix it, if you don't make it whole, it'll take everything." The ticking grew louder, filling the room, and the golden glow from the clock brightened until it cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. The man stepped back into the night, his final words chilling me to the core. "Fix it or destroy it. But whatever you do, don't let it stop ticking." The door slammed shut, leaving me alone with the clock once more. I turned to face it, its steady hum filling the air, and realized something that made my blood run cold. The hands were moving faster now. The hands of the clock moved faster with each passing second, their jagged path slicing through the hours like a blade. The ticking filled my workshop, relentless and deafening, drowning out every thought except one. The clock was alive. I grabbed my tools and approached it again, my heart pounding. The golden lines on the gears pulsed faintly, as though they were breathing, and the intricate symbols etched into them seemed to twist and shift in the lamplight. I hesitated, the man's warning ringing in my ears. "Fix it or destroy it. But whatever you do, don't let it stop ticking." Destroy it? I wasn't even sure how to begin. The clock was no ordinary machine. It was something else, something ancient and far beyond my understanding. I reached for the gears again, my fingers trembling, and the moment I touched them, the room shifted. The walls of the workshop melted away, replaced by a vast, endless void. The air was thick and cold, filled with the faint hum of ticking clocks, and the ground beneath me felt soft and unstable, like walking on clouds. A voice echoed through the void, deep and resonant, vibrating through my chest. "You have entered the mechanism." I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, only the endless void and the ticking that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The void seemed to ripple in response, and the ticking grew louder. "You are the keeper. The clock's purpose must be fulfilled. What purpose? I demanded, clutching the golden lines on my arms. What does it want? The void shuddered, and suddenly I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their forms pale and translucent, their faces gaunt and hollow. They moved slowly, their limbs stiff and jerky, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. Each one bore the same golden lines on their skin, faintly glowing, and their eyes burned with an unnatural light. One of them stepped closer, its face eerily familiar. My stomach twisted as I realized it was the woman who had warned me. Her voice was faint, distorted, as though coming from a great distance. We are what remains. The clock takes, and we endure. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. You were the keeper? She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. We all were, but the clock's hunger is endless. It will consume you, as it consumed us, unless you fulfill its purpose. The ticking reached a fever pitch, the void trembling violently, and the figures began to fade, their translucent forms dissolving in a golden mist. Before she disappeared completely, the woman's voice echoed one final time. Find the broken piece. Restore the clock. Only then will you be free. I blinked, and the void vanished. I was back in my workshop, the clock ticking steadily in front of me. The golden glow from the gears was brighter now, casting eerie patterns across the walls, and the hands had moved forward, hours this time. The workshop clock on the wall read 2:15 a.m. The grandfather clock read 9 a.m. My legs buckled, and I collapsed into the chair, my chest heaving. The ticking slowed, but the hunger in the air remained, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. Find the broken piece? How? Where? The clock hummed faintly, its golden light pulsing like a heartbeat, and I knew one thing for certain. The clock wasn't just measuring time, it was rewriting it. The room swayed faintly, the ticking of the clock digging into my skull like a nail. My fingers gripped the edge of the workbench, my mind spinning with the woman's final words. Find the broken piece. Restore the clock. Only then will you be free. But what was the piece? And where was I supposed to find it? The clock's hum deepened, the golden light from its gears flickering erratically. I stared into its intricately carved face, and for a moment, it felt as though the patterns in the wood were shifting, rearranging themselves. Then, beneath the steady ticking, I heard a faint grinding noise, like metal scraping against stone. I leaned closer, the sound growing louder, and the golden glow flared, momentarily blinding me. When I blinked the light away, I saw it, a small, jagged gap in the clock's inner workings. It was no bigger than a coin, hidden deep within the maze of gears, but the edges of the gap pulsed faintly with golden light, like an open wound. The scraping sound echoed from within, faint but insistent. This had to be the missing piece. The air in the workshop thickened, pressing against my chest, and the lines on my skin flared brighter, their glow matching the pulse of the clock. I reached for my tools, my hands trembling, and began to dismantle the outer casing. The clock resisted. Every screw was impossibly tight, the wood groaning under the pressure of my tools, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. It was as if the clock didn't want me to see what lay inside. Finally, with a sharp crack, the casing gave way. The grinding sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I peered into the exposed mechanism, the golden glow illuminating the jagged gap. And then I saw it. Wedged deep within the gears was something metallic, its edges sharp and uneven, as though it had been violently torn away. The surface was etched with the same strange symbols as the gears, glowing faintly in the golden light. I reached for it, but the moment my fingers brushed the metal, a jolt shot through my arm, and the room blurred around me. When my vision cleared, I wasn't in the workshop anymore. I was standing in a field, the sky above me dark and starless. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint scent of earth and metal. Around me, shadowy figures moved silently, their translucent forms flickering in and out of existence. The grinding noise returned, louder now, echoing through the still air. Ahead of me, a massive clock tower loomed, its spire piercing the black sky. The hands of the clock face spun wildly, and the grinding noise grew louder with every turn. The voice returned, deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground. The clock remembers. The piece is not yours to take. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening, as the golden lines on my skin flared brighter, their heat searing. "You want me to fix it?" I shouted into the darkness. "How can I do that without the piece?" The ground trembled, and the grinding noise rose to a deafening roar. "Restore the clock, or the time it takes will never be yours again." The shadows around me surged forward, their forms twisting and merging into a single, massive figure. It loomed over me, its glowing eyes burning with the same golden light as the clock. "Where is the piece?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the grinding noise slowing to a steady thrum. "Find the fracture. Mend the time that was lost." The ground beneath me gave way, and I fell into the void. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the workshop, my hand still clutching the jagged metal piece. The clock's hum was louder now, its golden glow flickering wildly, and the air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I stared at the piece in my hand, its sharp edges cutting into my palm, and realized with a sinking dread what the voice had meant. The fracture wasn't in the clock. It was in time itself. The jagged piece in my hand glowed faintly, the symbols etched into its surface, pulsing in rhythm with the ticking of the clock. My workshop felt impossibly still, as if the air itself had been stripped of sound and movement, leaving only the relentless hum of the clock. The voice's cryptic warning rang in my ears. "Find the fracture. Mend the time that was lost." I turned the piece over in my hand, its edges sharp and uneven. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Metal, but alive somehow, warm to the touch and faintly vibrating. The golden lines on my skin pulsed in response, sending a dull ache through my chest. The fracture wasn't just in the clock. It was in time itself. "What does that even mean?" I muttered, my voice trembling. The clock answered with a loud, jarring tick, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. The hands on its face spun wildly, the golden glow from its gears flaring brighter, and the pulsing in my chest grew stronger, almost unbearable. I staggered back, clutching the piece tightly, as the clock's hum deepened. The room around me blurred and shifted, the air thickening until it felt like I was wading through water. And then the clock stopped. The silence was immediate and suffocating. The golden light vanished, plunging the workshop into darkness. For a moment, I thought it was over, that the clock had finally given up. But then the world around me shattered. The workshop dissolved, replaced by a chaotic swirl of light and shadow. I was falling, tumbling through a fractured void where pieces of places and moments spun wildly around me. I saw flashes of scenes, glimpses of people and places I didn't recognize. A woman crying beside a broken clock. A child reaching for a golden fruit hanging from an ancient tree. A soldier standing in a field of frozen time. The voice returned, deep and resonant, vibrating through the fragmented void. The clock has held the fracture together. Without it, time unravels. I clutched the jagged piece tighter, my breath coming in short gasps. What do I do? I shouted into the swirling chaos. The void trembled, the pieces spinning faster, and the voice replied, "Restore the clock, seal the fracture, only then will time be whole." The golden lines on my skin flared brightly, their heat searing, and the jagged piece in my hand pulsed violently. A blinding light engulfed me, and the chaos of the void collapsed inward, pulling me with it. When the light faded, I found myself standing in the center of a massive clock tower. The gears were enormous, their intricate mechanisms stretching high above me, and the air hummed with an almost electric energy. The jagged piece in my hand glowed faintly, its pulse matching the rhythm of the tower's vibrations. Ahead of me, the heart of the tower stood exposed, a massive, central gear surrounded by golden light. Its surface was fractured, a jagged gap splitting it in two, and the grinding noise I had heard earlier echoed through the chamber. This was the fracture. I stepped forward, my legs trembling, and the golden lines on my skin flared again, their light spilling across the chamber. The central gear shuddered, the grinding noise rising to a deafening roar, and I realized the jagged piece in my hand was the missing fragment. The clock hadn't just been stealing time. It had been holding this together, keeping the fracture from tearing everything apart. The voice returned, softer now, almost mournful. "Restore it, keeper. The debt must be paid." The grinding noise filled the chamber, reverberating through the enormous clock tower. Each vibration shook the floor beneath me, and the jagged gap in the central gear pulsed with golden light, as though it were alive and waiting. The piece in my hand burned hot now, its symbols glowing brighter, their patterns shifting and rearranging in ways that made my head spin. The golden lines etched across my skin pulsed in rhythm, urging me forward. I didn't know what would happen if I restored the gear. I didn't even know if I'd survive. But the clock's unrelenting pull left me no choice. I stepped closer to the massive central gear, its fractured surface gleaming in the golden glow. The grinding noise faltered slightly, as if the clock itself was holding its breath. "Is this what you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The voice answered, deep and resonant, cutting through the chaos of the chamber. "The clock must be whole. Time must endure." I reached out, the jagged piece heavy in my hand. The moment the fragment touched the gear, the entire tower shuddered, and the grinding noise exploded into a deafening roar. The golden lines on my skin flared brighter than ever, their heat searing through me as the piece locked into place. The fractured gear groaned, its jagged edges knitting together, and the grinding noise grew sharper, almost like a scream. The chamber filled with blinding light, and I felt myself being pulled forward, drawn into the heart of the clock. I wasn't in the tower anymore. I stood in a swirling void of golden light, surrounded by the faint ticking of countless clocks. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against my chest, and the golden lines on my skin burned with an unbearable heat. In the center of the void was the clock, its intricate gears and carvings suspended in midair. The jagged gap in its central gear was gone, replaced by the fragment I had restored. The clock's hands spun wildly, faster and faster, their movement blurring into a golden streak. The rhythmic ticking grew louder, filling the void with an overwhelming pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. "You are the keeper," the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. "The fracture is sealed. The clock is whole." I fell to my knees, gasping for air, as the golden light dimmed slightly. The lines on my skin faded, their heat subsiding, and I felt the clock's pull loosen, its oppressive weight lifting. But the voice wasn't finished. "The debt has been paid, but the clock still hungers." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I fixed it. Isn't that enough?" The void trembled, and the ticking slowed. The clock must endure. Its keeper must guide it. The realization hit me like a blow. I hadn't escaped the clock's grasp. I had become its caretaker. The hunger I had felt wasn't gone. It was just quieter, waiting for its next opportunity. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be it. There has to be a way to stop this." The void began to collapse, the golden light fading into darkness, and the voice spoke one final time. "The clock remembers. So must you." When I opened my eyes, I was back in my workshop. The grandfather clock stood in the center of the room, its face gleaming faintly in the dim light. The jagged carvings on its frame had smoothed, and the golden glow from its gears had dimmed to a faint shimmer. The hands ticked forward, steady and slow, their rhythm filling the silent workshop. For the first time in what felt like hours or days, the clock was quiet. But I knew it wouldn't last. The silence in the workshop was oppressive. The clock sat motionless in the center of the room, its golden glow faint but persistent. Its ticking was slow and steady now, no longer frantic or chaotic, yet every sound carried the weight of inevitability. I stood frozen, my hands trembling, as the golden lines on my skin faded into faint scars. The pain was gone, but the memory of it lingered, sharp, relentless, and impossible to ignore. The fracture was sealed. The clock was whole, but the voice's warning still echoed in my mind. The clock remembers. So must you. I moved cautiously toward the clock, every step measured and uncertain. The air around it was heavy, vibrating faintly with an energy that made my chest tighten. I couldn't help but feel it was watching me, waiting. The hands on its face ticked forward, steady and unyielding, and I felt a pull in my chest, a faint, familiar hunger. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You're fixed now. You don't need anything else." The clock's hum deepened, its golden glow flaring slightly, and the hunger in my chest sharpened. I staggered back, clutching at the faint lines on my skin, as the air grew colder. The whispers returned, faint and mournful, weaving through the room like a warning. The clock must feed. Time must endure. I slammed my hands on the workbench, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "I fixed you," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I sealed the fracture. What more do you want?" The whispers didn't answer. The clock's ticking remained steady, but the hunger inside me grew sharper, clawing at my insides. I stumbled toward the door, desperate for air, and threw it open. The cold night hit me like a wave, but it didn't help. The hunger followed me, gnawing at my chest, as if the clock had reached inside me and taken root. The faint glow of the clock spilled out into the night, illuminating the trees at the edge of my property. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, their voices weaving into an urgent chant. The clock must feed. The debt is endless. I collapsed onto the ground, clutching at my chest, as the golden lines on my skin flared faintly. Images flashed in my mind. Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, moments that didn't belong to me. The clock wasn't just stealing time. It was taking lives, consuming their memories, their very existence, to sustain itself. And I had become part of it. When I finally stood, the whispers had quieted, but the hunger remained, a constant, gnawing ache. The clock's glow dimmed, its ticking slowing slightly, and I realized with growing dread what it wanted. It wasn't satisfied. The fracture might have been sealed, but the clock's hunger was endless. It needed more, and if I didn't bring it what it wanted, it would take from me instead. I stepped back inside, the door creaking shut behind me, and stared at the clock. Its presence filled the room, heavy and oppressive, and I felt its pull more strongly than ever. The whispers returned, softer now, almost coaxing. "Bring it to us. The clock must feed." I grabbed my coat and stepped into the night, the weight of the clock's demand pressing against me like a noose. The hunger followed me, sharp and unrelenting, and I knew I had no choice. The clock had chosen me, and it was hungry. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stumbled down the empty road, the whispers following me like a shadow. They weren't loud, but they were persistent, threading through my mind with each step I took. "Bring it to us. The clock must feed." The weight in my chest grew heavier with every passing moment, the golden lines on my skin burning faintly, their glow pulsing in rhythm with the ticking of the clock I'd left behind. It wasn't just a machine. It was alive, and its hunger had become my burden. I reached the edge of town, just as the first hints of dawn painted the sky. The streets were silent, the houses dark, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe I could stop, that I could resist the clock's pull and find another way. But the hunger surged again, sharp and relentless, twisting through me like a blade. I had no choice. I walked toward the only house that still had its lights on, a small, cozy place with a faint glow spilling from the windows. I hesitated at the gate, my stomach churning, but the whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chant. The clock must feed. The debt must be paid. I knocked on the door, my knuckles trembling. It opened moments later to reveal an elderly man, his face lined with age, but warm with curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice kind. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I need your help," I stammered. My car broke down a little ways back, and I didn't know where else to go. The man nodded, stepping aside. Come in, come in. You must be freezing. I entered, the warmth of the house washing over me, but it did nothing to ease the cold knot of dread in my chest. The whispers quieted as I followed the man into the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Let me get you something warm to drink, he said, moving toward the kitchen. As he disappeared, the hunger surged again, sharper this time, and I felt the golden lines on my skin flare brighter. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Bring him to us. The clock must feed. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands trembling as I fought against the pull. But the hunger was too strong. When the man returned with a steaming cup of tea, I forced a smile, my stomach twisting with guilt. Thank you, I said, my voice barely audible. It's no trouble, he said, sitting down across from me. Where are you headed? Before I could answer, the whispers grew deafening, filling my mind with their unrelenting chant. The golden lines on my skin burned, and the hunger twisted through me like fire. I couldn't fight it anymore. I need to show you something, I said, my voice trembling. It's back in my workshop. It won't take long. The man strands, his brow furrowing, but he nodded. All right, he said, standing. Lead the way. The walk back to the workshop was silent, the whispers fading as the clock sensed its offering drawing near. The man followed me without question, his trust a weight on my shoulders that grew heavier with each step. When we entered the workshop, the clock's golden glow flared, filling the room with an eerie light. The air grew heavier, vibrating with a deep, rhythmic hum, and the hunger in my chest began to ease. What is this? The man asked, his voice tinged with unease. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. I'm sorry, I whispered. The clock groaned, its ticking growing louder, and the golden light surged forward, enveloping the man. He cried out, his voice sharp with fear, but the light was relentless, pulling him toward the clock's face. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face, as the man's screams faded into silence. The golden glow dimmed, and the clock's ticking slowed, its hunger finally sated. The whispers returned, soft and mournful. The clock endures. The debt is paid. I sat in the silence of the workshop, staring at the clock as its hands ticked forward, steady and unyielding. The golden lines on my skin faded, their glow dimming to faint scars, but the weight in my chest remained. The clock was quiet now, its hunger satisfied for the moment, but I knew it wouldn't last. The debt would return, as it always did, and the clock would demand more. I was its keeper, bound to its hunger for as long as it endured, and the clock always endures.